Hello, everybody, and welcome to the See Me, Be Me podcast, where we celebrate diverse trailblazers whose journeys inspire and empower us. Today, we're honored to have a very special guest, Professor Kalwant Bhopal. Dr. Bhopal is a globally respected scholar and advocate for social justice, currently serving as the director of the Centre for Research in Race and Education at the University of Birmingham. With a career spanning decades, she's been a powerful voice addressing systemic racism in academia and beyond. As the author of 9 books and countless articles, including her latest, Race and Education, Reproducing White Supremacy in Britain, she has profoundly shaped the discourse on equality, diversity, and inclusion. Dr. Bhopal's groundbreaking research has influenced policy, including the Race Equality Charter, which aims to break down barriers for Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff and students in higher education. Her work challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about institutional racism and to reimagine education as a truly inclusive space. Today, we'll delve into her inspiring career journey, her reflections on the role of education in shaping lives, and her insights on building a future where everyone can thrive. Kalwant, welcome to the See Me, Be Me podcast.
Thank you so much, Niall. What a huge pleasure and honour it is to be here today to talk to you about my journey. Thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you for agreeing to be a guest. Now, before we go on to some of those topics, I want to strip it back to the very beginning. Tell me about your journey and your background growing up.
That's a really, really good question to start with, I think. So basically, I come from a family where education was valued. However, my parents were both from very working class backgrounds. They both worked in factories. They worked extremely hard, but they instilled in us, as immigrant parents do, right? An immigrant mentality that education will set you free, education will make you economically mobile. It was quite difficult growing up because we were very poor, actually. There's 7 of us, and both my mother and my father worked all hours and also to raise us as well as feeding us, which was hugely, obviously, very, very significant. So my mother got married when she was 16. She had an arranged marriage. Her parents were too poor to send her to school, so she didn't learn to read and write. However, she was very ambitious for her children. My dad did go to school. He didn't go to university. So when we were growing up, education was considered to be hugely important. But one of the things that I think people like myself lack, if you like, is that when I decided to go to I wanted to go to university, I had no idea that there were different kinds of universities, for instance. You know, we know that there's Russell Group universities, there's elite universities, there's post-1992, million plus, etc. So I just went to my local university, which was a post-1992 university. So I had no idea that there was this hierarchy of different types of universities, which we know now, and my research has shown this, that the type of university that you go to has a significant impact on social mobility, future life chances, and indeed the decisions that young people make. So I went to university, and it's a really interesting story, actually. I wanted to become a social worker. And I had a lecturer who profoundly changed the direction of my life. He actually said to me, and he said, "You're not allowed to say this to anyone, but I really think you should go to the LSE and do a master's degree." And I was like, the LSE, they're not going to take me. And he helped me develop my application. And I got a place at the LSE and I did a master's in sociology. When I was doing my master's, I had this fantastic professor, Sylvia Warby, who is still around. And she inspired me to really challenge and think about society, equality, and social justice, particularly around intersectional identities such as race and gender and class. And then I applied for a PhD scholarship and I got the scholarship, and here I am today. Now, had that one person not said to me, go to the LSE and apply for a master's, I would probably be a social worker. Nothing wrong with being a social worker, right? But I do feel as though we need that one person, or we need several people in our lives who recognize that there is some kind of ambition in individuals. And a lot of people don't have that. And I think that's really, really important. And myself, as somebody who is now in a position of power, I think it's really important for me to encourage my students and early careers researchers to really, I mean, this is going to sound a little bit corny, right? But really to aim high. Anything is absolutely possible as long as you have the means to do so. I'm from traditionally a very working class background, grew up in poverty, but now I know that I have entered the middle class and I'm completely different to how my parents really were and brought me up. So really that's the background of my story. And as a young child, I remember, and I talk about this in one of my books, in the playground being called, I won't use the words, racial slurs and told that I smell of curry and go back to your own country, and even being spat in the face, actually, as a child in primary school. And from that very young age, it instilled in me a sense of social justice, that, we need equality. People should be treated and respected, not because of what they look like or where they're from, but because of the people that they are. And I think that those experiences, because despite the fact that they were negative, have actually encouraged me to address issues of equity and social justice.
I love that. I love that. I'd be keen to know as well, in terms of your upbringing. You mentioned when you were at university, you found that one mentor, I think Professor Sylvia Warby, who inspired you to go and study sociology, doing a master's. Who were your other role models growing up that you would say made a significant impact on your life to get you to where you are now? And I'd love to know, because, a lot of people from diverse backgrounds growing up, I've experienced it. It's probably my parents and the Windrush generation, or grandparents, sorry, Windrush generation, even my parents experienced some growing up here in Britain. But for some people, they may have experienced racial abuse. It's kind of hard to get past that. Sometimes it's in terms of mindset. The mindset, it can almost kind of break people. But obviously, you've been able to get past that and, become a trailblazer, and it's not deterred you from, getting to where you're at. Can we talk a little bit about that? Other inspirational role models for you, and, in terms of that mindset of you're not going to let that kind of thing stop you from achieving what you want to get, where you wanted to get to?
I think that's a really good question, and a very important one, because Niall, I'll be completely honest with you. I mean, I'm 60 next year. There were no role models for me. And it was really, really difficult to look beyond that racial trauma that I experienced, and that we all experience as either, Black or brown or mixed heritage individuals. And it does traumatize us. And I think it's true what you say, either makes you or it breaks you, which is a really unfortunate way of looking at it. If I think about my background, and and even now, I experience racism every single day of my life, be it microaggressions, be it overtly. And obviously, as we get older, we learn to deal with it in particular ways. It did traumatize me, actually, and it has affected me. But equally, it's made me want to fight to address it and to understand how I, as an individual, in whichever way I can, through teaching my students or writing or publishing, is to really get people to understand the discursive nature and the narratives around why individuals are racist and what we can do to challenge that. So in some respects, despite the trauma and the history of racism, that how it has affected me personally, it's also made me want to be stronger and fight on, especially for social justice. And, I've been an academic for 35 years, and that's all I've ever done. I've only ever tried to address issues of racism, exclusion, marginalization, and social justice. If we think about why that's important, it's this notion of education is a right. Education is not a privilege. And education is something, and unfortunately, I argue in my current book that it has actually become a privilege, but it is a right. It is not a privilege. And every individual, regardless of their ethnic background, their socioeconomic status, whether or not they live in poverty, has the right to a decent education. UNHCR outlines the different rights, the rights of the child, the rights to freedom, the right to food. Education falls within that. And I think that that's really, really important. And for want of sounding corny, education will set you free because knowledge is power, right? And Stuart Hall, who's a very famous Black academic, one of his very famous quotes is, "The university is a critical institution or it is nothing." And that's how I see education. Education, as educators, we should encourage our students to be critical, not to accept anything, to question everything. Where is your evidence? And how can we move forward with this evidence to address issues of injustice?
I love that. And it is important to be critical and question everything. I find that, a lot of people do not question everything, and we take things at face value with what we do in terms of STEM and STEM outreach and consultancy. We meet a lot of businesses who probably never engage with somebody of color and talk about the business leaders. They only see or hear what they see on the news, how people are portrayed through society and the media. And then you stick somebody like myself in the room, or my younger brother, and it's like it's a shock to them. It's like, oh wow! Like, I remember one time I went to a business event and I was in front of a council leader at the time. I won't mention the name. And I approached him and spoke to him about the work that we're doing with the Blair Project. And his response was, "Where are you from?" And I'm born in Manchester. I'm a Mancunian and lived here all my life. And I said to this person, I'm from Manchester. But then he responded, "Oh, where are you actually from, though?" I was like, "I'm from Manchester." And I said it, and then he asked me again. And I obviously I didn't think too much about it at the time. But when I went home and I spoke to my mum about it, I was like, "Mum, this person kept asking me where am I from?" Like, I believe he or she thought that, because of how I spoke and things like that, I must have been from London or somewhere else. And it's like, it really clicked for me. Like, wow, there are these things where there's stereotypes and biases that people have. But it was probably very subconscious. It made me think things in a different light. But speaking about the role of education, you previously mentioned that, the failure of UK universities to address racism adequately. Could you share some examples of why universities are getting it wrong? And I suppose the whole education system, what would need to change?
Again, another great question, but I just want to pick up from what you've just said, Niall, which I think is so interesting. So even now, I sometimes am asked, "Are you really a professor? Did you really write those books?" And often I will go into meetings and it is assumed that I am the administrative person taking the notes. And I remember early on in my career, I was very young then, I used the photocopier, and I did have my PhD, and a white middle-class man told me off and said that students were not allowed to use this photocopier, but I was a member of staff. So look, I get it, so it's this notion of, and that idea, I talk about it in my book, where are you from? No, where are you really from? So in relation to your question, in a lot of most of my work, I look at higher education and the ways in which racism works. Now, racism works in many different ways in higher education. So, for example, we have an attainment, a BME, I don't like that word, Black and Minority Ethnic Attainment Gap, but I'll use it for the sake of argument. And what that is the difference between the numbers of students who are from Black and Asian backgrounds and the numbers of white students who achieve a 2-1 or a first degree. So if you are a white student, you are more likely to leave university with a 2-1 or a first compared to BME groups. If you are a white student, you are less likely to be unemployed 6 months after you graduate than BME students. If you are a white student, you are more likely to complete your degree than BME students who are more likely to leave or to drop out. So we know that there are differences within and between that category. So if you are an Indian or a Chinese student, you do very well. If you are a Pakistani, Bangladeshi, or a Black student, you do not do so well. So what we have are these subtleties around different forms and types of racism. So BME students are more likely to be marked lower for their essays and their assignments than white students. BME students are more likely to experience microaggressions from staff and indeed their peers. And BME students are more likely to drop out of university citing unfair treatment, and indeed a curriculum. So we have all these different issues, but we have to step back, I would argue, and we have to look at what's going on in schools. So, for example, the curriculum in schools does not really tell the true history of imperialism and colonialism. So we need to decolonize the curriculum, whatever that means. I'll say that in inverted commas, because that in itself is a problematic issue. And also, if you look at the school population, teachers and head teachers, 95% of them are white. So young children at secondary school do not have adequate role models. And then they go into universities and they do not have adequate role models. So, for example, I think there's 117 Black professors in the whole of the UK. Only 27 of them are women. So professors are more likely to be white and male. So I think it's going back to that issue we were talking about in terms of role models. If you do not see someone who looks like you when you're in secondary school, and then that transfers into higher education and indeed into the labour market. So if you look at, I don't have the figures in front of me, forgive me, but if you look at the figures of CEOs and judges and individuals in high-powered positions, whichever part of the labour market, whether it's the NHS, finance, banking, white men, and indeed, actually, in some cases, white women predominate. So there's no role models for Black or brown young people. So I think it's really important in terms of teaching the correct, accurate curriculum, actually, and including imperialism and colonialism, oppression, violence, slavery, etc., which was actually, manifested by the British government on minority communities. Secondly, employing more teachers of colour. Thirdly, addressing overt racism. The problem is, I would argue, and this is a very, one would argue, a controversial perspective. So I'm a critical race theorist. Critical race theory is a theory that argues that racism is endemic in society. Now, universities, for instance, they will do some things. They will have try and have good EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. They will employ the odd Black or brown professor. But as a critical race theory, I would argue they will only do these things if it benefits them more, rather than addressing white privilege and white supremacy. So controversially, I argue that higher education works to perpetuate a system of whiteness and white supremacy. So of course they're going to invest in EDI because it benefits them more, rather than the groups to which it is aimed. And as a parent, if I'm looking at a website as in terms of where I want to send my children to university, if that website says, yes, we address social justice, yes, we have the Race Equality Charter, yes, we have great EDI initiatives, of course I'm going to send my kids to that university, because they'll be paying £9,250 a year. So higher education, unfortunately, within this neoliberal world that we live in, has become, I would argue, a capitalist enterprise. And that's why I say that education is is really more of a privilege than a right.
Yeah, it's something that we've always noticed as well in terms of some of the work that we do, is that EDI and these universities have these targets. There are some proactive trailblazers who do care about making a difference, but unless it, for some people, it's just, this allows us to tick an ESG box, and you know what, we can unlock more investment or we can get more contract opportunities. But unfortunately, if something like that wasn't in place, people just wouldn't do it or wouldn't care. Whether it's in the education system or whether it's in the business world, where, more people of colour do get the opportunities. And I'm not talking about these just, in terms of business, just junior opportunities. Like, it's important that people of colour see role models in management level, or even at director level, or even at a board level. How do we go about changing that? We can be vocal, we can mark. What do you think is a way that we can actually make a huge difference?
So I think we have to be really bold. We talk about it every day. We write about it. We go on marches. Nothing changes. Okay. Post Macpherson, the tragedy of Stephen Lawrence, who was murdered back in the 80s, we had the Macpherson report. The Macpherson report, I remember it well. I thought, gosh, these things are going to change, right? But we got a definition of institutional racism in the Race Relations Amendment Act. 20 years on, nothing has changed. Okay. So, and then we had the murder of George Floyd, and we had the Black Lives Matter movement. So what I argue is that race is only addressed during particular historical moments, such as Stephen Lawrence, such as George Floyd, only for things to revert back to business as usual the next day so that racism continues, right? So what we need to do is we need to be bold. And I would argue there's several ways that we can do this, but the first way, I think, is to penalize financially institutions that don't address racism. Do you know why? Because money doesn't talk, money screams. If you have an organization that is told, including universities, that they will be financially penalized if they don't address the attainment gap, if they don't address or understand real racism in their universities, they would act. Because look, all of these are capitalist enterprises, right? Secondly, I think we should work towards having a target system. We cannot have quota systems in the UK because they are illegal. So we need to have targets of the numbers of young people at all levels of employment in an organization. So we need a target system for the number of professors. We need a target system for the number of pro-vice chancellors, associate professors, etc., at all levels of industry. Now, every time I say this, people say, well, does that mean it's a tokenistic tick box? Absolutely not. Okay. It's taking the best candidate. Now, in the Equality Act was introduced in 2010. It brought together all previous legislation into one single act. Now, it's important because it includes race, which is a protected characteristic. In the Equality Act, it says that if you are interviewing, and I've been on many, many interview panels, and unfortunately this doesn't happen. If you are interviewing a black person or a brown person and a white person, you are obliged to employ the black or the brown person because race is a protected characteristic. That rarely happens. And I'm sure you've seen this as well in interview panels, because there's always a way where people can talk around it and say, well, actually, no, that person is better. Okay, we've got the Equality Act. It's in the Constitution, it's law. Let's have a target system to say that this organization has to have 10 professors who are from a BME background, has to have this many associate professors without lowering standards. Then it doesn't become a tick box exercise. It doesn't become tokenistic. So we have to be bold, I would say, in the measures that we're taking, financial and target systems. And I think also, and again, this is even bolder, in America, we have historically Black universities and colleges. And there's a lot of evidence to show that these are very successful. The individuals that go to these universities have very positive role models, are less likely to experience racism, and also doing incredibly well, particularly in that transition to the labour market that we've spoken about. Why can't we have that in this country? Why can't we move towards that? So those are three bold assertions. I mean, whether they will happen, I don't know, but it's something to think about, right?
I would agree with following those as well. In terms of recruitment for whatever roles, people will always argue, oh, well, it should be the best person for the job. But sometimes I feel like it's an excuse used by certain demographics of people just to say, well, you know what? Yeah, let's not hire the person from a Black Asian background. Let's keep it white. What would you argue to that?
I think that's absolutely correct. I've recently did some research with students who are in the third year of their undergraduate study. And we know that the decisions that students make in their third year, just before they graduate, has a huge impact on future life chances, access to the labour market, and social mobility. And Niall, what those students said to me was that especially since Brexit and since the election of Donald Trump, and this was previously when he was elected the first time, is that they felt as though the racism they experienced in higher education would be worse when they entered the labour market, because Brexit, as you know, and the election of Trump emboldened individuals to be overtly racist. So it reminded me of back in the day when my parents came to this country and emigrated here as immigrants, where the racism that they experienced was overt. And within the labour market, you're absolutely right. There are organisations, and you only have to look at those statistics, which tell us how many BME people are there, that are predominantly white. And these individuals will always find an excuse to not employ the Black or the brown person. So racism continues from from schools to higher education and the labour market. And in fact, it's actually got worse. And quite frankly, I have very little faith in the current government, because I don't think the Labour government are interested at all in race. I would go as far as saying that, actually, maybe I shouldn't say that. I might get into trouble. I'll stop there. I would go as far as saying that their main issue of interest is class. So quite often when we talk about inequalities around race and ethnicity in education, the question that's always put to us, oh no, but it's the white working class that do the worst. Actually, it isn't the white working class. It's Gypsy, Roma and traveller children. Then it's young black kids that do the worst. It's what you were saying in terms of where are you from? So in my recent book, I argue that despite the fact that race is addressed during particularly historical moments, what's happened since BLM is, race is silenced and re-silenced. Race is secondary. It's about class. It's about gender. Race is used as symbolic violence and gaslighting. Are you sure it's racism, Niall? And race is used to disguise other elements of discrimination. Where are you from? No, where are you really from? And I argue that all of this narrative and discourse works to perpetuate a system of whiteness and white supremacy, which works simply to benefit white groups. And all of the statistics in business, in the labour market, demonstrate that to us. But the likes of Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party would tell me, actually, things have got better. Look at me. I'm black. I'm in this position of power. And I argue that people like her and Rishi Sunak are able to perform whiteness. So they're the acceptable face of blackness and brownness. So you have this whole narrative. What's really interesting, and this is from a critical race perspective, if you have a black person or a brown person who says that racism doesn't exist, we have moved on. Okay, which was very, very interesting in terms of our current government. And also the Sewell report, which was a report that was published around educational inequalities, which said there's no such thing as institutional racism. Then that individual is given greater status, because who better than a black or a brown person to say racism doesn't exist, right? So I think that there's so many different factors involved in understanding how racism works and how it perpetuates a system that works to reinforce white privilege.
I remember reading the Sewell report. Oh gosh, I had that blanked out in the back of my mind.
Sorry to traumatize you.
You brought back that trauma, Kalwant. Oh, sorry. It was,
right, come on. Yeah. Really? You're telling me institutional racism doesn't exist? Please, really? How absolutely insulting. And what's really interesting about that report, and I've read it because I analysed it actually for my book, it's really interesting that what the Sewell report does is it blames families. So it's your mum's fault, Niall. It's your dad's fault. They didn't bring you up correctly. It's not the education system. It's because you're not working hard. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps and do better. And that's so frustrating, because that, for someone like me who's researched this area for 35 years, we know structural, institutional and individual racism happens every day.
And that's what I want to talk to you about in terms of institutional racism. Racism, I feel like, is totally different in the UK compared to, or maybe Europe compared to, let's say, the US. Now, my thing is that I think racism in the US, it's very direct. If somebody wants to call you something derogatory, they'll say it. Whereas in Europe, or especially, my experience just being in Britain, it's very subtle and it's done through actions and, passive aggressive behavior and things like that. Could you touch upon that in terms of your experience and some of the research that you're doing in terms of maybe the contrasts between racism in Britain compared to in the US?
So that's a really good question, because I would argue that in the UK, it is subtle, but it isn't subtle. It is and it isn't. So it depends on where you are and what situation you are in. At university and events that I go to, of course, racism is there, but it's microaggressions. It's through microaggressions, not being given eye contact, not asked your opinion, treated as though you are a second-class citizen, and you're really considered, there's a stereotype, I think, around Asian women. So quite often people are quite surprised that I'm articulate and I can speak well and I can express myself. They don't expect that. So those microaggressions, I think, are fundamental to the everyday experiences of Black and brown people in the UK. So in that sense, it's subtle, but it's not so subtle, because look at the recent race riots in August. Those were overtly about racism. Overtly. We had white groups that were setting on fire hotels where they wanted to murder people because they thought they were refugees or asylum seekers. Absolutely unacceptable behavior. So that's all about race. If they were white, that would not have happened. Even war has a racial element. So when the Ukrainian war and Russian war happened, families were paid £350 a month to take in Ukrainian refugees. The war in Syria was going on. The war in Palestine, which is continuing. Everything has a racial element. Everything, even war. Even war has a racial element. I would argue there has, in fact, now been an increase in far-right racism and fascism in Europe, because we've had the election of, for instance, Melanchoni in Italy, and other elections where we've had overt increase in overt racism. And we see that with Le Pen, also in France. The racism is there, but I would say it's different. And it's expressed in a different way. And I would argue there's racisms rather than racism, because I think the geographical location within which racism plays out is very, very different, right? So the racism you and I experience will be different to the racism that Black or brown people experience in France, for instance. And America is, where do we start? That's a completely different ball game, right? I have the figures in the book. By the numbers of Black men that have been shot by white police or indeed strangers is significant. And we know that happens. But I think America is very, very complicated, because on the one hand, you have that overt racism where racial slurs are used. Innocent men are frequently shot for no reason. And there's a huge history of that. But then on the other hand, if you look at higher education in universities, there's a real significant number of Black and Hispanic and brown individuals who are in senior positions. So the statistics that I've looked at, that if you go to America, you're more likely to have men and women from Black and brown backgrounds who are presidents, i.e. vice chancellors, who are deans, who are heads of departments, who run HSBCUs, etc., etc. So I think on the one hand, it is progressive, but on the other hand, it isn't. It's very, very, it's more complex. I do think that racism is now it always has been a global phenomenon. And I think that given the current events that we have, that we're living, we live through very, very troubled times. I think these times are marred by risk, fragility and insecurity, not least that because of the war in the Middle East, but also because people are encountering a cost of living crisis. You know, we're on the brink of huge poverty, which I think goes underestimated. And you know who those groups are that are the worst affected? Black and brown groups. I do actually wonder how history is going to look back on this time and how we are going to be held accountable for a genocide and so on and so forth. And it makes me very sad because there are so many complex things going on. And because of that, I think that racism is global, and I don't think it's better. I think it's different in different countries.
So many far-right organizations that have popped up, and the thing that they always pin it on is people from, people of different color, from different backgrounds. They're coming over here, or they're here and they're taking jobs, or they're taking the lifestyle from you, the British people, you, the French, the German. That's always the thing that, is the first argument to these far-right organizations, is that, it's the foreign people or the people who are not white who are causing the problems for you. And I always go back to the fact is, what is the government doing about it? Why aren't they shutting it down, being vocal? And I suppose it's from an education point of view, what is your future hopes? But what is of future hope for things to change? But what should the government also be doing to play a part and to shut down these things? And
I mean, I think that's a really, really important question, because the government is who everybody looks to for answers. Yeah. Now, I'm not hopeful for this government. I don't know if you remember what happened to Diane Abbott when, I can't remember the guy's name, when he called her, he said that looking at her makes him want to kill or shoot Black women or something. Forgive me, it's probably a misquote. That was a great opportunity for Keir Starmer to come out and say, this is racist. They did not come out and say that it's, if that isn't racist, I don't know what planet you're living on, okay? He didn't come out and say that this is racist behavior, it's unacceptable. Now, he could have actually been arrested for that. You can actually be arrested for hate speech and incitement to hatred, incitement to killing. That is something that we should look for our governments to do. But they won't do that. Come on. Keir Starmer is supporting a genocide. How is he going to come out and say that this is racism? Sadly, I do feel as though part of me feels like, I shouldn't really say this because it sounds really depressing. Part of me feels as though I don't have much hope. And then the other part of me feels like I have a huge amount of hope because I see young people going on these marches, fighting, free Palestine. We need social justice. We need equity. And they are the future. Okay. Mm-hmm. Of course, the onus and responsibility shouldn't be on them, but hopefully they are the future generations that are going to shape policy making, that are going to think about social justice and inclusion. But I do feel, I'll go back to, I think I've done what politicians do. I've fudged your question, but I will go back to what I've just said. We do live in troubled times, right? We live in really fragile times and they are marred by insecurity and fragility and risk. And I think because of that, it's very difficult for me to give you a straight answer. So forgive me.
No, it's fine. It's fine. And I suppose, it was Frank Hester who made that comment. But also as well, I'm just thinking for the listeners, they might have heard the terminology white privilege. Could you define what exactly is white privilege? My
book is called White Privilege, my previous book. So white privilege, I think, is a really important term. I draw on the work of Peggy McIntosh, who talked about it back in 1988. So white privilege is really this invisible knapsack that white people carry on their back. It's invisible. So it includes blank checks. It includes access to certain places that they can go. It includes them being able to do certain things so that they're not stopped. So let me give you examples. So white privilege means you can walk through customs without being stopped. White privilege means you're less likely to be stopped and searched by the police. White privilege means you can use a restroom without being arrested. White privilege means that you can leave the courtroom a free man, even though you've shot somebody. That's what white privilege means. And I experience, racism, white privilege every day, where I've been, for instance, in my local train station, white people just push in front of me. Am I invisible? Can they not see me? I'm often ignored. I'm often not given eye contact. So white privilege gives you all these entitlements due to the crassness of the color of your skin. And the first thing that we do when somebody walks into a room is we make a judgment on them based on what they look like. So someone will judge you, Nile, differently to how they will judge a white person. Immediately, they will make a stereotype and a judgment. That's what white privilege is. And white privilege gives you access and it enables you to have access to things that black and brown people do not have. And white privilege is taken for granted. It's assumptions that white people take for granted in their everyday lives, that you or I will never know what that feels like.
Anyone who's listening to this who is white, what should they be thinking about going forward? Is it just recognizing that they have this white privilege, or should they be using it to try and change things? Somebody was thinking, well, oh gosh, I've got this thing, like this is invisible backpack. What should I be doing? What should I be doing? Should I just recognize it?
So I think there's several things that white people can do, white groups can do. So the first thing is to recognize and acknowledge it, that they are in this position of power. That's the first thing that they can do. And the second thing, I think, and this is really, really important, is to use your identity and your positioning in a positive way, okay? So I believe, just like I believe education is a right and not a privilege, I believe that silence is complicity. Okay, if you are a white person and you're sitting in a room and there is black or a brown person who is experiencing racism or microaggressions, if you do not speak up, you are complicit in that racism. You are complicit in perpetuating that whiteness and white privilege. So I think we need white allies. Okay, I think that's really, really important. White people that will speak up for black and brown people, because we know that when a white person speaks up about racism, it carries far more kudos than me or you speaking. When I talk about racism, oh, she's got a chip on her shoulder. She's got a problem. It isn't racism. Is it really racism? So I think those are the two important things that white people can do. And the last thing that I would like to say on that is a failure to acknowledge racism results in a failure to act upon it. And that's really, really important.
Definitely. I've always discovered in business, it can be very hard to walk into a room and get people to believe in you, invest in you, because it is the color of your skin. It's how you present yourself, and there's always these things subconsciously and maybe even consciously in other people's minds that's that I'm not going to take a risk or work with you. It's so important to have allies, and especially white allies, and it's such a difference of me walking to a room alone, and then the difference between me walking with somebody who is a close friend or I've done business with in the past, and they've been able to open doors, and only through, it might be in some cases through that person opening that door, is someone else willing to work, or they would consider it take a risk. But I would just say, you know what, it's working collaboratively together. If people recognize that they have this privilege, but also, you know what, if they see something, call it out for what it is.
Exactly.
Sometimes, if you're a person of color, you call it out, you're seen as threatening, and why are you doing this, and you're argumentative, especially for black women as well.
It's delegitimized, isn't it? Forgive me for interrupting. So I'm seen as the angry brown woman, and it's often, if I say it's racism, oh, you always say it's racism. It's delegitimizing my opinion. And I think that it's really interesting, isn't it, how the discourse and narrative around identity, if it's a white woman saying something, she's being assertive. If it's Kalwant saying something, she's being aggressive. So it's all those labels, and I'm sure, I know that the evidence shows you as a man, a black man, you get it worse than me because you are male. And there's a huge amount of evidence to show that. The stereotypes around black masculinity, around threats and violence. And so I think it's really important to understand, and I agree, white allies are so important.
Do you know what, we've covered a lot, we've covered a lot today, and in terms of your research, and what your research is on those difficult topics and covering obviously issues of racism. What I want to know is throughout the years you've been doing it, how do you stay motivated, Kalwant, in terms of tackling issues like racism, which are so deeply ingrained?
There's a huge amount of emotional labor that goes into this kind of work, right? And I'm sure you see that as well yourself in the work that you do. And I think, and throughout the years, I've had a huge amount of abuse. I've got quite a lot of followers on Twitter, I'm kind of moving towards blue sky now for obvious reasons. But I've received abuse on Twitter. I've received threats over emails where I've had to call the police, where my family and I have been in danger. I've been told, go back to your own country, if you don't like it here, blah, blah, blah. So it does take a lot of emotional energy, and it's very emotionally draining. So the thing that really motivates me is I'm very, very passionate about addressing these issues. And quite frankly, the thing that motivates me is my kids, and also the students that I teach, because they are the future. So I think I'm in a position where I should be fighting to ensure that the future for the next generation, for our students, our children, is a better one than the things that we have experienced. And I think also it's a really important topic. I myself alone probably can't change much, but if I change one person's opinion, my job is done. Yeah. And one of the things that Derek Bell, who's the founder of critical race theory, he says that what we have to do if we're working in this field is we have to keep talking about it. We have to keep talking about it. We have to keep having these difficult discussions, because once we stop, the far right have won. So we have to keep, it's almost like the George Floyd thing. You have to kind of keep your knee on the nets. Yes.
And don't allow them an opportunity for it to be swept under the rug. The government has to play a huge part in that. And we did see a little bit of, there was the riots that went on, and people targeting hotels and facilities where refugees were staying, which were just racial attacks. And you did see little pieces that, the government were coming out and saying, they're arresting people for hate speech. And,
But no, they called them protests. They were race riots. Call them what they are.
Yeah.
The discourse and the narrative is language is not neutral, right? Paulo Freire, who's a very famous educationalist, he said, he's dead now, language is never neutral. These are not protests. Protests are people marching for Palestine and walking peacefully. These are race riots. This is violence. And that's what really annoyed me. It really made me very angry. And the media have got a huge part to play in this. I'm a news junkie. I don't watch, certainly don't. Al Jazeera is the only news I watch now. But I love watching the news. I am a real news junkie. But I've been so incensed by the news, the way that things are reported. And, you have and fake news. People believe what they hear and see.
And I suppose last two questions more before we move on to the bonus question. So talking about the education system and diversity. So with the Blair Project, what we focus on is increasing diversity across STEM careers. We work with everybody, but my big passion, key focus is around underrepresented youth which happen to be predominantly from Black, Asian, minority ethnic backgrounds. What do you think the education system should be doing to support people from underrepresented backgrounds, and how can we change the belief and mindset from the young peoples to believe they can be anything that they want to be?
I think it's quite a basic thing in terms of kind of forgive me for going back to what we said earlier. I think first of all we need positive role models, and we know that there are positive role models out there, and we should use these individuals to say, well, look at me, this is what I've done. That's at the very basic level. But at a more practical level, I think we should incentivize young people to move into STEM, for instance, by providing universities should be made to provide ring fence scholarships for Black and Asian groups, so that we can say, look, we have this scholarship and we want you to go into a STEM subject because we know the benefits of doing STEM, particularly in the long term around the labour market issues. And then we will encourage young people to do that. So we need to have ring fence funding that's set aside for these groups. Okay. We need positive role models. And once the individuals have got into the universities to do these STEM subjects, they need to have support all along the way. And that support has to be consistent, right? It can't just be at the beginning or the end. It has to be year on, year out until the individuals finish. So those are practical elements. And look, it's not rocket science. Why are universities not doing this? We need support on an individual level of role models, but a more practical level. And we need strategic thinking in how we can support these young individuals, because they are our future STEM leaders, right? And I just think that that's really important. And really, I think let's not underestimate the role model issue, because I know we've talked about it a lot in this conversation, Niall, but I do think it's really, really important. When I was at university, I was not taught by one Black or brown professor or lecturer. Oh my gosh, that's terrible, isn't it? I know. I mean, that was a long time ago.
I would love to know then, because I thought Professor Warby was.
No, right.
Oh, right. Okay. So I'd love to, if she's still here, I'd love to get her on the podcast. And why, what made her? Where did the desire become from her to make a difference and become an ally?
I think she. Well, this is it, isn't it? This is what role models do. She saw the potential in me, and now actually I do this. I mean, she's great. She was and she supervised my PhD as well. But now with my students, if I see a student who I know there is something there, I mean, I encourage all my students. So I will just really, at this stage in my career, what I want to do is I want to support young people. I want to support early careers researchers, and whatever I can do to support them, I will do that. And like my PhD students, for instance, they are fantastic. So what I want to do is to support them. And I think that that's the question, isn't it? Should a role model look like you or not?
Role models can come in all varieties, but I suppose it does. it is important to have somebody who looks like you or
Yes.
is from a similar kind of background for that person to believe that that is possible, or we
Yes.
can do it. I mean, we've done it previously with our STEM programs in the early days, where we used retired engineers from Jaguar Land Rover to deliver some of our STEM programs. And although they were highly engaging and were great programs, the young people struggled to see their possibilities through the realities of that trainer. Whereas when we changed it the following years, and it was myself and my younger brother delivering the programs, they could see their possibilities in the realities of us.
I think maybe you need a bit of both, right? But I do
Bit
think
of both, yeah.
I do think that having someone who looks like you, and like you've just said, somebody who's maybe a similar age, is really, really significant as well.
And I suppose last question before we move on to the bonus ones. You've written numerous books covering the topic that we spoke about today. But I'm going to challenge you on this one. If you could recommend one book that everyone should read that isn't yours to understand racism in education, or maybe on a broader spectrum, but if there is one on education, what would it be?
That's a really good question. And it would be Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell. Really easy to read. Derek Bell was the founder of critical race theory, and it's a really easy read. And he's got he's kind of like uses stories as well to demonstrate racism, and it's absolutely superb. That's the one I would recommend.
Okay, that's a book recommendation on top of yours as well. Brilliant. So now we're going to head to the bonus part of the podcast, where I'm going to ask you 3 fun questions. One of the questions I will say is that I will be judging you on this answer. If you do give me the right answer,
oh gosh, I'm
we
scared.
will have to stop the podcast right here, Kalwant. So are you prepared?
Okay, I think
I'm helping. See, I've got both my hands clasped like this. I'm praying you give me the right answer.
Oh gosh, I'm really scared now.
Here we go. So, does pineapple belong on a pizza? Yes or no?
Absolutely not. Pineapple is a fruit.
Thank you. Oh, same. We're saying we're going to get past the other 2 now. There has been some guests. There has been some guests that have said it should be on a pizza.
Absolutely not. It's a fruit.
It's a fruit. It should not be on it.
Totally.
Yeah. And finally, this will be an interesting one. If you could go home tonight and throw a dinner party, and you can invite any guests, past or present, who would they be?
3 guests. That's a really good one. Martin Luther King would be the first one. Barack Obama would be the second one, and Aretha Franklin, because I love soul music.
So you'll have yourself, Martin Luther, and Barack Obama talking about society, politics,
and me and Aretha, and then you doing the soul music and dancing, singing, to lighten up the mood a little bit.
Yeah, she'll be there singing her heart out.
Totally. What a great and you, of course. What a great dinner party, right?
Oh, I'm so there. If I get the invite, I'm so there.
And now
I'll be dancing with Aretha while you guys are chatting.
Yeah, totally. And note, Niall, they're all people of colour.
Yes.
Not all women, but all people of colour. So that's cool, right?
That is cool. Do you know what, Kalwant? This has been an amazing episode of the podcast, and you know what? There's certain things that I've learned that I didn't know before, and I'm sure even a lot of our listeners will have been intrigued by topics that we spoke about today, and I'm sure they're going to want to know a bit more about you and learn more. So this is your chance to plug yourself. If social media, books, website, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So if you're interested in my work, just go onto the University of Birmingham's website. I'm on there. My book that I've just published with Penguin, which I'm really proud of, called Race and Education, Reproducing White Supremacy in Britain, is available in all good bookshops. My Twitter handle is @Kalwant Bhopal. My Blue Sky handle is @KalwantBhopal.bksy.social. That's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for being on the podcast. And if you have enjoyed today's episode, guys, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and even share our podcast episodes. We've got some more exciting guests coming on the podcast, and stay tuned for the next episode. But for now, Kalwant, thank you for being a guest.
Thank you so much. It's been a huge pleasure. Thank you for inviting me, and what an honour. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.